Now, our guest host today is Nick Parsons. He is head of research for the UK and Europe at also the global co-head of FX strategy at National Australia Bank. Always a very long title.
Louisa,
Hello,
good
Nick.
afternoon.
Good afternoon to you. Also with us is Raoul Ruparel, head of economic research at Open Europe. Raoul, welcome to you as well. Let's start with what Merkel and Cameron's message really was this afternoon. Did you find it a unified message, or are they still quite a ways away from each other?
Well, I think they did strike a slightly different tone, and there were a lot of hopes pinned on Merkel's speech. You know, giving a speech to both houses of parliament is very unusual, and a lot of people thought she would roll out some grand reform strategy for Europe, and that simply wasn't the case. It was a very Merkel-like speech, very diplomatic. She did give some good news for Cameron on the reform side, spoke about reducing red tape, improving economic competitiveness, focusing on trade, and trying to decide what the EU should really be doing and what should be done at the European level. But she also stressed that she's not willing to give Cameron everything he wants, or she doesn't quite know what Cameron wants yet, because he's yet to lay out his strategy. So I think it was a middle-of-the-road speech, and although they are clearly have a good relationship and are on a similar side of the political spectrum, they do both have their own domestic concerns and different approaches to Europe.
And Cameron's message, of course, being there will be an in-out referendum, but we hope that reforms have moved far enough before that.
It was one of those speeches that you could essentially find what you were looking for in it. It might have disappointed everybody, it might have pleased everybody. Don't think it added a great deal to the sum of knowledge either for markets or for diplomats. It was very much a holding sort of speech. I think what was important was for Mr Cameron to be seen to be with Ms Merkel, and also to be seen to be with her in such exalted circumstances, as was just mentioned there. An address to both Houses of Parliament and dinner with the Queen is what Ms Merkel gets. Monsieur Hollande got a pub lunch in Oxford. And so I think we can see there what this government's priorities are and with whom it wants to be closest to in Europe.
And also seemingly a pretty stark warning to Russia as well, coming from Cameron especially, saying, look, we're watching you, and we want to make sure that you uphold the law with regards to the Ukrainian territory.
Yeah, well, I think Cameron and the UK government have been criticised somewhat for being absent from the Ukrainian situation. Obviously, William Hague wasn't one of the foreign ministers that went over there to strike the accord. That being said, he has been in Washington and has been speaking to the IMF to try and secure aid for Ukraine. So I think that is a bit of a harsh criticism. But it was important that Cameron and Merkel came out together and showed a united front there, and that they are very strongly behind Ukraine. But I can't help but feel that this is still creating the same choice for Ukraine. It's a very stark choice between Russia or Europe. And that's what created the split in the first place. Now, that is what helped feed the tension. So,
but that's exactly what they said it shouldn't be about. You know, that for the Ukrainian people, it shouldn't be about a choice that's only between Russia or Europe.
Well, in some senses, it was a boilerplate speech, because he could remove the word Ukraine and insert any one of a dozen country references, and the same things would have been said. So in that sense, it wasn't specific to that situation. It was a generic template for what could happen for any trouble spots anywhere in the world.
With regards to the changes of the reforms, I mean, do you think there are going to be enough changes to EU reforms for Cameron or for the UK people to vote to stay in the EU?
It's not clear at all that we're going to have a straightforward referendum as that in that fashion. First of all, we don't yet know what questions are going to be put to the people. We don't yet know whether there's a government that's going to be elected that's even going to offer a referendum. So I think really we're just arguing about the shades of grey here, and it's far from certain that this even kicks off a process. I think there are many people who would wish to see it that way, but actually in the cold light of day there's very little that's new here.
So 50 shades of economic referendum grey.
I didn't say that, Louisa.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Well, what do you think, though, is the next step in the relationship between Germany and Britain?
Well, I think it's now time for Cameron to really fill in his agenda. I mean, there's been so much talk of this broad reform agenda for the EU, and he laid out his approach in his Bloomberg speech a year ago, and yet nothing has been filled in. And I think that has created a real problem across Europe, because we have this vacuum about what the government's EU policy is and what their reform agenda is, and we have a lot of people speaking into that vacuum but not really clear on what the government wants. So he needs to start making concrete policy demands or laying some policies on the table and road testing them with leaders and electorates around Europe.
Yeah.
And hopefully he did that with Merkel today.
We're just looking here at some graphics on screen right now about how beneficial do you think the euro has been for your country, and the question was asked of British voters, of German voters as well, and you can see beneficial, blue, German voters. British voters thought not very beneficial, obviously, as we're not in the euro, right? Not beneficial, and whatever the last one was, right? But there seems to be, there's a big difference. There's a big difference between
well,
the
I think the Germans are still keen on the euro and they still have strong support for it. And I think that highlights the difference in the cultural approach towards Europe. I think that in many cases Britain see it as a business relationship and they've seen the euro as harming that business relationship because of the recent tensions, whereas the Germans see it as a very deep sort of marriage structure, a very cultural link-up, and they believe the euro is still worthwhile in that endeavour, despite the problems that may have happened over the past few years.
Yeah. Raoul, it's been lovely seeing you. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon again. Raoul Ruparel, Head of Economic Research at Open Europe.